of Human Rights has been able to travel to China and speak directly with the most senior government officials in the country and other interlocutors on key human rights issues in China and globally. I appreciate the government's efforts in making this visit happen, particularly the arrangement for my virtual meeting with President Xi Jinping. I was also able to meet with State Councilor Wang Yi, the Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court, and with senior officials on public security, justice, ethnic affairs, and human resources, the State Procuratorate, and the governor of Guangdong province. I also met with the All China Women's Federation, and during my 2 days in Kashgar and Urumqi, I met with a range of officials, including the Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the governor and the vice governor in charge of public security, among others. I visited Kashgar Prison and the Kashgar Experimental School, a former vocational training and education center, among other places. In addition, I was able to interact with civil society organizations, academics, and community and religious leaders, and others inside and outside the country. In advance of my visit, my office and I met virtually with a number of civil society organizations that are working on issues related to Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and other parts of China. My visit has also been informed by the work of the UN Human Rights Mechanisms on China over many years, and the preparatory work done by my office and my advanced team that arrived in China on the 25th of April. I should state from the outset what this visit was and what it wasn't. This visit was not an investigation. Official visits by a high commissioner are by their nature high profile and simply not conducive to the kind of detailed, methodical, discrete work of an investigative nature. The visit was an opportunity to hold direct discussions with China's most senior leaders on human rights, to listen to each other, raise concerns, explore, and pave the way for more regular, meaningful interactions in the future, with a view to supporting China in fulfilling its obligation under international human rights law. Considering China's significant role in multilateralism, the visit was an opportunity for me to also discuss several other regional and global issues where China can use its leverage to bring political solutions. To those who have sent me appeals asking me to raise issues or cases with the authorities, I have heard you. Your advocacy matters, and my visit was an opportunity to raise a number of specific situations and issues of concern with the government. I will continue to follow up on such issues and instances of concern on a sustained basis. It would be presumptuous of me to try to encapsulate the full complexity of this vast country's human rights situations in one statement, but allow me to highlight the key topics we were able to discuss at length. Poverty alleviation and the eradication of extreme poverty, 10 years ahead of its target date, are tremendous achievements of China. The introduction of universal health care and almost universal unemployment insurance scheme go a long way in ensuring protection of the rights to health and broader social and economic rights. China's efforts in support of the multilateral 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, both at home and internationally, are also valued. We stress the importance of advancing gender parity and appropriate geographical distribution. Over the years, there has been important legislative and judicial reforms. On gender equality, I welcome revision of the law on protecting women's rights and interests, which should bring about several improvements for protection of women's rights. I also commend the recent reform of the Civil Code that introduced provisions on sexual harassment, as well as the anti-domestic violence law that provides for restraining orders to protect women and children at risk. Of course, as in every country, implementation is key. So it will be important for the authorities to be vigilant in that regard and respond to concerns about how the law is applied in practice. I would like to see more women at all levels of political representation and have encouraged businesses to create the conditions for more women at the top as well. I welcome China's stated aim of ensuring quality development closely linked to strengthening the rule of law and respect for human rights. This is formulated in the Human Rights Action Plan of China and other policy documents. My team had in-depth discussions on how national legislations and practices must reflect international human rights laws and standards, particularly in relation to law enforcement and judicial procedures, and we look forward to continuing to share our expertise with the government and the judiciary. The commitment in the Human Rights Action Plan of China to enforce more rigorous procedures for reviewing capital sentences and implement a more stringent mechanism for reporting and reviewing death penalty cases is also welcome. It is important to issue data on the death penalty, and I do hope China will join the growing international momentum towards abolition of the death penalty. In my discussions with senior officials, the themes of development, peace, and security arose in every meeting. Of course, for development, peace, and security to be sustainable, it needs to be inclusive and rooted in protection of human rights. I share the concerns of a number of UN human rights mechanisms about laws and policies to counter terrorism and radicalism and their application. Violent acts of extremism have a terrible, serious impact on the lives of victims, including those tasked to protect the community. But it is critical that counter-terrorism responses do not result in human rights violations. The application of relevant laws and policies and any mandatory measures imposed on individuals need to be subject to independent judicial oversight with greater transparency of judicial proceedings, and all victims must be able to seek redress. In the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regions, I have raised questions and concerns about the application of counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures under broad application, particularly their impact on the right of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities. While I'm unable to assess the full scale of the VETCs, I raised with the government the lack of independent judicial oversight of the operation of the program, the reliance by law enforcement officials on 15 indicators to determine tendencies towards violent extremism, allegations of the use of force and ill treatment in institutions, and reports of unduly severe restrictions on legitimate religious practices. During my visit, the government assured me that VETC system has been dismantled. I encourage the government to undertake a review of all counterterrorism and de-radicalization policies to ensure they fully comply with international human rights standards, and in particular that they are not applied in an arbitrary and discriminatory way. Before coming to China, I heard from some Uyghur families now living abroad who have lost contact with their loved ones. In my discussion with the authorities, I appealed to them to take measures to provide information to families as a matter of priority. I also share the concerns of UN human rights mechanisms about legitimate activities by lawyers, human rights defenders, and others being penalized under the national security framework. UN human rights bodies have found the system of residential surveillance constitute arbitrary detention and have called for its repeal. My interactions with NGOs in China were also enriching. There is important work being done to advance gender equality, the rights of LGBTI people, of people with disabilities, and older people, among others. China has a tradition of grassroots engagement, and I cannot overstate how important this is. Broadening the space for meaningful participation and advocacy by civil society is crucial to strengthen participation and the freedom of expression. On the Tibet Autonomous Region, it is important that linguistic, religious, and cultural identity of Tibetans be protected, and the Tibetan people are allowed to participate fully and freely in these decisions about their religious life and for dialogue to take place. I discussed education policies in the Tibet Autonomous Region and stressed the importance of children learning in their own language and culture in the setting of their families or communities. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region has long been respected as a center for human rights and independent media in the region. It is important that the government there do all it can to nurture, not stifle, the tremendous potential for civil society and academics in Hong Kong to contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights in the HKSAR and beyond. The arrest of lawyers, activists, journalists, and others under the national security law are deeply worrying. Hong Kong is due to be reviewed by the UN Human Rights Committee in July as a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I have called on China to also ratify the covenant, which it signed in 1998. China's recent ratification of of the two International Labour Organization conventions, Labour Convention 29 and 105 on forced labor, Once deposited, will be a welcome and an important starting point for protecting fundamental principles and rights at work. Beyond ratification, it will now be important to build a broad-based system encompassing not only on labor inspection and enforcement, but prevention and due diligence. Civil society actors, including business, trade unions, NGOs, and the media, also have an important role to monitor compliance and highlight gaps. I encourage China to engage constructively with ILO. I was also able to engage with a representative of China's business community, and I'm encouraged to see Chinese companies and sectors embracing human rights standards for their operation and supply chain. Given the many intersecting global crises facing the world today, including climate change, threats to peace and security, and instability in the global economic system, as well as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has a very important role to play as a key contributor in multilateral and regional fora. We agreed to establish regular engagement between the UN Human Rights Office and the government of China, including through an annual senior strategic meeting for discussions of issues of respective interest at national, regional, or global levels. We also agreed to establish a working group to facilitate substantive exchanges and cooperation between my office and the government through meetings in Beijing and Geneva, as well as virtual meetings. This working group will organize a series of follow-up discussions about specific thematic areas, included but not limited to development, poverty alleviation and human rights, rights of minorities, business and human rights, counterterrorism and human rights, digital space and human rights, judicial and legal protection and human rights, as well as other issues raised by either side. This will allow for structured engagement by my office with China on a number of human rights issues. And this is especially important that my office does not have a country presence. The working group will also provide a space for us to bring to attention of the government a number of specific matters of concern. The government has also stated that it will invite senior officials from the office to visit China in the future. I spoke to everyone I met in China, regional and national officials, civil society, academics, diplomats, and others with candor, with a sincere desire to make progress on the promotion and protection of human rights for all. I hope we can build on this open and frank approach to carry forward these exchanges in a meaningful and impactful way. I thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your statement. We will now go to questions, which we will take two at a time. And I would ask, if you are interested in asking a question, that you please raise your hand. I will now ask my colleague to say this in Chinese.
谢谢召集专员。现在是发问的时间，如果你有兴趣发问的话，请你举手。
Thank you. If I may take as the first question from CCTV. Colleague, could you please interpret in Chinese? CCTV.
首先是央视的朋友，请你消除静音，打开你的麦克风。
Please go ahead, CCTV, and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Welcome to China.
请你解释。
Please go ahead, CCTV.
OK. 请允许我用中文提问。可以听到吗 ？Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. Okay. Could you please allow me to raise question in Chinese? Thank you. 5月24号，我们看到美国德州小学又发生了严重的枪击案，造成了19名的儿童死亡，这非常让人痛惜。联想到美国长期存在的严重的种族主义、种族歧视，以及在海外设立黑监狱，针对难移民的强迫劳动，以及滥施单边制裁、侵犯他国人权等问题，请问高专对此有何评论？您是否准备对美国在国内外都存在的严重的侵犯人权问题来进行调查？谢谢。
Thank you. Interpreter, could you please interpret for the High Commissioner? High Commissioner, are you getting the interpretation? Unmute the High Commissioner, please.
I have not received the interpretation yet.
Okay, if we maybe can move to the next question while the interpretation is prepared. Can I please call on, I think, Reuters, Tony Munro. Tony, please unmute yourself. Tony, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, while we wait for Tony to unmute, interpreter, please interpret the first question to the High Commissioner. Okay, can we please bring in Tony Munro from Reuters? No, in that case, High Commissioner, once you are ready, could you please answer the first question? Thank you.
Well, this I really didn't receive the translation.
CCTV, can you please ask the question again?
But it has to be in English because it looks like the interpreter is not interpreting there.
Okay, let us proceed with questions in English while we make arrangement for Chinese interpretation. I see that there are many hands raised. If I could maybe call on Helen Davidson of The Guardian. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, thank you very much, High Commissioner. Of your visit to Xinjiang, can you tell us about the ability to speak to people on the ground? Were you able to speak to Uyghur civilians, members of the general public without supervision? Were you able to have free and open discussions with them about their experiences on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Guardian. High Commissioner, are you able to answer that question?
Yes, well, if I would say, first of all, I have to say that prior to my visit here, I met civil society and individuals working on a full range of human rights matters. My advanced team also met members of civil, and I myself also met members of civil society while I have been here in China, in Guangdong and in Xinjiang, including a number of organizations that are partnering with the UN. And all of these conversations and this meeting were organized by us. They were unsupervised and were organized by us as OACHR. Of course, being part of a bubble because of the COVID-19 restrictions, we could meet some people and not everyone. I mean, it's like happened with COVID-19, but the people we were able to speak to, it was in an unsupervised manner.
Okay, thank you, High Commissioner. If we could maybe move on, I hope that the interpretation will now happen because I would like to ask the Nanfang Daily to ask their question. My colleague will call on Nanfang Daily in Chinese.
现在是南方日报的朱小芳，请你发问。
Nanfang Daily, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And my question is, I want to know that are there any outcomes you get from your this visit to China? And what is your comment on China's effort and achievement in improving and protecting human rights? Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner, are you able to answer that question, please?
Yeah. Ready? Okay. Well, I will have to say that first of all, that the visit was an opportunity to raise and discuss concerns directly with China's most senior leaders, and as well as with officials performing different functions on the ground. So it provided an opportunity for me to better understand the situation in China, but also for the authorities in China to better understand our concerns and to potentially rethink policies that we believe may impact negatively on human rights. And I hope that my visit will have encouraged the government to review a number of policies to ensure that the human rights will be fully respected and protected, to build on areas where there have been advances, because I already mentioned in my initial statement all the areas where there are advancements, on all the areas where they're under review, like the women's law, etc. And to strengthen China as a society built on rule of law, transparency, and one that respects and protects human rights of all its people without distinction, in line with international human rights standards. If you want me to tell you which could be maybe the main outcome of the visit, is that, as I said, we had the possibility of discussing at the highest level, and I think this will imply that there will be a lot of areas that we have identified that could be very useful in the future to continue cooperating and collaborating, as I mentioned in my initial remarks.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I'm looking at many raised hands, as you can imagine. So forgive me if we just take some time just to see who is raising their hand. I understand that CNN has a raised hand. Selina, could you go ahead with your question, please? Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you so much for your time. I wanted to ask, I know that you are also working on a separate report on the conditions in Xinjiang that has been years in the making and is supposed to be published in a matter of weeks. Could you talk a bit about, you said your trip was going to provide new understandings. Is any part of your trip going to impact what is in that report?
Before, my visit has not been an investigation. I know I'm muted. Okay. Like I said, my visit was not an investigation into China's human rights policies and practices. So in that sense, it's not linked to the report. And I intend to continue engaging with the Chinese authorities on all human rights issues, including on Xinjiang, in the future. Of course, we have had in this discussion reactions of a variety of reaction of those concerns that we need to consider. And of course, if there's any issue that we think needs to be considered in a deeper way, we'll do that.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I did see a raised hand from the People's Daily, Wu Lejun. Would you still like to go ahead with your question? And if so, my colleague will now say this to you in Chinese. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
人民日报的吴丽俊，你现在还有兴趣发问吗？我们刚才看见你的手。
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
can you hear me?
We
Yeah,
can.
thank you.
We can. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thank you for having this, Madam High Commissioner. My question for you is, after your visit to Xinjiang, so in your mind now, what are the differences between the real Xinjiang you see and the Xinjiang portrayed by some Western medias? Thank you.
Please.
Yes? Are you able?
No, first of all, I think there was a first question. We didn't have the translation, but one of my colleagues here sort of told me the short version of the question because she was not going to translate. And it was about, if I'm not wrong, the school shooting in the US, about racial discrimination and all kinds of issues related to the US. As probably the majority of journalists know, that after George Floyd's murder, we presented a report at the Human Rights Council on racial discrimination and law enforcement. And in that report, it was not only in the US, it was done mainly in countries of the Americas, including the US, of course, Europe, and that's it, mainly America and Europe. And what we found out is that we did see an important linkage between being an Afro descent and being a person who had bigger vulnerability in terms of how it would be treated by law enforcement. A lot of people who have been killed by law enforcement officials, and the lack of access to justice, and the lack of adequate information for the families, et cetera, et cetera. And this we saw in many countries of the world. And we prepared this report with a lot of recommendations, and with recommendations how to do a transformational change. Those recommendations are available to all member states who really want to fight racial discrimination and to really want to ensure that African descent have the same rights and are protected as everyone. And in that sense as well, there has been now created a group of experts who will continue in a deeper analysis of what are the issues that are related to law enforcement and if I would say racial discrimination in particular, to try to identify which can be policies that we can recommend member states to stop that. We also say that in order to stop racial discrimination, countries need to look at their history, need to look at the history of slavery and all the discrimination that comes from a lot of prejudices for a long time. And you need to dismantle all of that systemic discrimination if you really want to ensure the rights of Afro descent. We have done the report and will continue monitoring and reporting every time it's needed, because unfortunately, we still see many killings. The killing in Texas was very sad, and it shows that the problem is not solved and that everybody needs to continue struggling against racial discrimination and against people who believe that they're superior than others and who feel they have the right to kill other people because they're not this racial superiority. We need to stop that from happening. It's a terrible human rights situation.
Okay, thank you, High Commissioner. Will you now address the question from the People's Daily? Would you like a repetition of the question?
She mentioned the differences. I got it, Liz. I got it. But as I set up in my statement in Xinjiang, yes, we could see, of course, that we visited the exhibition in the hotel of the impact of on the incident of terrorism, 59, if I'm not wrong, the heavy, if I would say, impact on civilians, on police forces, but also against the clerics and even imams, and the terrible situation that it was produced by that, and the terrible impact on the life, the safety, the security on the people living in Xinjiang. And we also discussed that it was important that even though counterterrorism policies do exist in many countries and they're many times really needed, that we need to be ensured that those policies are in compliance with international human rights law. and that so there are serious allegations that we raised. We understand the need of the state to ensure security for everyone, always, but in particular in the context of terrorism. But we need to be sure, and this is a discussion I have with many countries of the world, that those policies have to be in compliance with human rights law.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I'm conscious of time, so if I could take 2 questions this time, and I see that there was a raised hand from the Nanfang Daily, Xu Xiaofeng. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you. Nanfang Daily, are you able to unmute? Yes, there you are. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to ask these questions about what's your comment on the international human rights situation, and how is the China's role in the international human rights governance? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. May I call a second question? This time, I believe Austin Ramsey, you're there from the New York Times. Austin Ramsey, could you unmute yourself, please, and ask your question?
Hello, Commissioner. I'd like to ask you, you mentioned that you had heard the calls of Uyghurs who raised the cases of family members who had gone missing. Can you tell us anything more specifically about that? And in addition, some of those Uyghurs said that their family members had been threatened after making these appeals to you, and some of them said that they had been locked in their homes during your visit, apparently in an effort to keep them from visiting with you. Have you heard about that, and what is your reaction to it?
High Commissioner?
Yes, well, on the questions, the first question, yes, I think, as I've been mentioning many times, because she asked me a little bit about the human rights situation in the world. And yes, we all know that we have violations. I mean, the human rights situation in the world is not as good as it should. We have problems in many parts of the world. And of course, we have different impacts and different concerns. And we have been discussing in the Human Rights Council about the situation in many countries, having the situation in Sri Lanka, about the situation in Yemen, about the situation in Syria, about the situation, of course, in Myanmar, about the situation in Ukraine, about the situation Ethiopia. We could continue naming a lot of countries, many of them in a conflict setting, others not in a conflict setting or in a post-conflict setting, but still many of those issues still remain in the impunity. So yes, there is a lot of issues around the world in human rights, unfortunately, and probably they will continue. And we're really concerned of course, the war in Ukraine, and we have been calling to ensure the international community do their biggest efforts in sense of trying to bring peace to the region, and to also take note, if I may say, of the consequences on human rights that will come not only in Ukraine and Russia, in the neighborhood, but also in the rest of the world, due to the social and economic consequences that will come due to the high level prices of the wheat, of the oil, of the fertilizers, the inflation that we've already been seeing in many parts of the world, that will mean that many people will have famine, food insecurity, and probably other bigger problems that will lead also to social unrest. So we feel that this year will be a very difficult year for whole humanity, and we hope that member states will do the right thing. In particular, in the area of China's role, we have been discussing, China has been a strong supporter of multilateralism, and we understand that it's a key global player. So I have asked the Chinese authorities to consider using its influence to bring political solution to end this crisis and to do all it can to support the provision of humanitarian assistance to population in need, particularly for those most vulnerable.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Have you finished your answers to these questions?
On the other question, I am aware of the number of people who are seeking news of the fate of their loved ones. I heard from many of such families in advance of my visit. And these and other issues were raised with the authorities. I cannot, because we don't want to do harm, I cannot go into more details, but we have raised a lot of cases, very important cases. We have kept a close watch for any pressures or intimidations related to my visit and intend to follow our usual policies if and when they arise. And I will continue to follow up these matters through different channels.
Thank you, High Commissioner. As I said, time is limited, but I believe we have probably time for just 2 more questions. Could I see, please, I believe Jack Lau from the South China Morning Post wishes to ask a question. Jack, could you please unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you so much, High Commissioner, for doing this. My question is, how much access and how free was your access to the detention centers, the camps, and the prisons that you talked about? And when you visited the civilians in Xinjiang and Guangzhou, did those include activists and dissidents who were detained or who have gone missing because they voiced out dissent that were not allowed under Chinese law? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Could I now ask Laurie Chen from AFP to unmute?
Thanks, High Commissioner. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about timing of this visit. So reports say that your current term as High Commissioner will end in September. And why the last-minute attempt to visit Xinjiang now, after over 2 years of negotiations with the Chinese, when your term is almost over, when many of the camps have been wound down, when almost all visible evidence of oppression in Xinjiang has been cleaned up, and when every person you come into contact with must quarantine later due to China's COVID control measures? During all this time, why did you not conduct remote human rights monitoring for Xinjiang, like your office has done for other regions, such as Crimea? Thank you.
As I said, we had a lot of meetings with a lot of interlocutors, but I understand that your question was particularly related to prisons. Yes, we did visit the current, is not a closed one, current Kashgar prison. We were able there to visit around, to see the different places, the places that where the prisoners were inside the places in their cells. We could visit the hospital. I mean, different facilities inside the prison. While they were explained, we visited also there is a court inside the prisons for prisoners who want to appeal to certain sentences and decisions, so they can have a trial inside. And discuss and try to obtain a less or to commute the punishment. And we also saw them in different activities while they were there. So I would say to that prison, the access was pretty open, pretty transparent. We asked many questions and they answered all of them. Those prisoners were mainly, I mean, that was a prison for men. It was not a mixed prison or a female prison. And the majority of them were there for different kinds of issues, not necessarily linked to, if I would say, terrorism or extremism. Mainly, I would say the majority were linked much more on other kinds of crimes So I would say in the visit to the BETC, well, it was not a BETC anymore. It was a school. But there was a person who was the vice president of the BETC until October 2009, when that BETC was closed. So we were able to ask a lot of, we would see, of course, the physical facility and so on, but we were able to discuss with him and others all the issues that have been raised, all the concerns that we have been hearing on the BTC. On the question of the timing, the truth is that we have been, I mean, I think your information is not exactly the correct, because we started talking about the visit. I mean, I was invited to visit by the Foreign Minister Wang Yi in December 2019, but unfortunately the COVID pandemic put a stop to discussions between the government and China and my office on the planning of the visit. And discussions really were resumed in December 2021, as you are aware. And one of the agreements that for me was essential before coming in a visit was that I could count with an advanced team that would come here, make all the arrangements, I mean, discuss all the places where we wanted to go, where we wanted to have access, the people that we wanted to go to mosque, that we wanted to talk to religious leaders, that we wanted to talk to civil society, that we wanted to talk to business leaders, etc., etc. So so my visit, when it would take place, it would take place in a way that we thought it could be a meaningful visit. So my colleagues came here on the 24th of April. They did some time of quarantine, but in that period of quarantine, they worked a lot through virtual meetings with all the stakeholders that we needed to. They also had meetings with civil society that was unsupervised, that was organized by us, and with other people who were organized by us. So they could really prepare a visit that I would do at this time of the year. And it needed to be now, because it was it could have to be after the Human Rights Council that ended by the end of March. So we needed April to organize and May to come. So that's the reason. And we have been working on this, and this is not the first time that we have expressed concern about the situation in Xinjiang. We have been following this situation closely. As we know, we have been working on an assessment, but of course, it will always need to be shared with the government. So, and we will continue engaging with the authorities on this regard.
Hi, Commissioner, thank you for that. I think, as I said, given the limited time, that is unfortunately all the time we will be able to take with your questions. We thank you for your interest. We thank you for your questions. I would just like to ask the High Commissioner if she would like to make any final remark after what has been a 6-day official visit to China, the first by a High Commissioner in almost 2 decades. High Commissioner, do you wish to make some closing remarks?
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your interest. I'm sorry it has not to be as long as probably many of you would like, but we are soon to take the plane back to Europe. And thank you so much for your questions and for your interest.
Thank you, High Commissioner, and thank you to all. Thank you from the High Commissioner and the team with her, and also from the UN Human Rights team here in Geneva. Good evening.